The wind screamed through Washington, D.C., as Ethan Marshall, a forgotten veteran, stared at the White House, his last shred of hope slipping away. 1 year ago, he commanded life-or-math missions in Afghanistan. Now, he's just another name on an eviction notice. But tonight, a reckless plan ignited in his mind. Crash Karoline Leavitt's live press conference and demand a job, on camera, for the world to see. What happens next will leave you speechless. Will he triumph or crash in flames? Stick around, hit that like button, and let's find out together, because this fight's just beginning. Ethan Marshall sat on the edge of his sagging mattress, the eviction notice crumpled in his fist. The words glared up at him, vacate by week's end. A few days, maybe less, until he'd be out on the streets of Washington, D.C., with nowhere to turn. A year ago, he'd been a logistics commander in Afghanistan, calling shots that kept his unit alive. Bullets whizzing past, sand clogging his throat, every moment a roll of the dice. Now, at 34, he was a shadow in his own country. No job, no future, no one giving a damn. 10 years of service, and all he had left was a duffel bag and a phone that stayed silent. He flung the notice onto the floor of his run-down Anacostia apartment. The rejection emails still stung. No industry experience, not a cultural fit, your skills don't align with our needs. He'd fired off hundreds of applications, warehouses, offices, even burger joints, and gotten nothing but silence or curt dismissals. Employers saw a veteran on his resume and pictured a broken man who couldn't cut it in their shiny corporate worlds. His savings were tapped out, burned through on rent and cheap noodles. The system he'd bled for overseas had turned its back, and now it was shoving him out the door. Last night, he'd switched on the ancient TV in the corner, the last thing he hadn't pawned. Static fizzed, then sharpened into Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, a New Hampshire native who'd sharpened her teeth as Trump's press aide before climbing to this role. She stood behind a podium, facing a pack of reporters with unshakable poise. Her voice cut through the air, precise and practiced. Job growth, economic reform, opportunities for Americans. Ethan barely caught the specifics, just the tone, the confidence. It was the sound of someone who still had a grip on life, someone who hadn't been crushed like him. That's when it struck him. A wild, dumb, reckless idea. If no one would hear his applications, his emails, his quiet pleas, then he'd force them to listen. He'd march into Karoline Leavitt's press conference tomorrow, step up to the cameras and lay it out. I need a job. Not charity, not a sob story, just a fair shot. He knew the odds. Security would be a fortress. He could be tossed out arrested, maybe worse. But for the first time in months, something sparked in his chest. Not quite hope, more like defiance. He was sick of being a nobody. Ethan stood, pacing the cramped room, his boots thumping on the worn floor, his mind split in two. One half yelled to stop. You'll get dragged off in handcuffs, you moron. You think they'll let some random guy barge into a White House event? He could picture it, beefy guards pinning him down, headlines painting him as a nutcase, his last scrap of pride torched on live TV. He wasn't an activist, wasn't some loudmouth with a cause. He was just a guy who'd hit rock bottom, and this could sink him lower. But the other half, the part that had pulled him through war zones, clung tight. You've got nothing left to lose. You've groveled, you've waited, you've followed their game, and what's it gotten you? He stopped pacing, fists balled up. He'd faced worse than this. He'd stared down gunfire, made calls that sent men home breathing or in bags. What was a room of suits and lenses compared to that? If he didn't act, he'd vanish. Another vet chewed up and discarded, a number no one bothered to tally. He needed to be seen, even if it cost him everything. He snatched his backpack from the corner, the same one he'd lugged through deserts. Inside, a wrinkled jacket, his military ID, a dying phone. No press pass, no invite, just desperation and a decade of grit. He zipped it up, slinging it over his shoulder, his pulse hammered, a mix of dread and determination. What if she brushes you off? What if they don't even let you talk? The doubts gnawed, but he shoved them aside. He'd trained for chaos. He could handle this. Tomorrow would shift something, whether it shattered him or broke the wall. Ethan glanced at the TV again. Karoline's face lingered on screen, mid-sentence, her eyes sharp and unflinching. She was younger than him, but she wielded power he'd never graze. Power to shape stories, to pick who got heard. He didn't know her, didn't know if she'd care or just sick security on him, but she was his opening. The press conference was at a hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue, a few miles off. He'd walk there, slip in, outsmart the guards. He had no speech, no strategy beyond getting to her and saying what he'd been choking on for months. He exhaled, his breath unsteady but firming up. Fear still chewed at him, fear of screwing up, fear of the aftermath, but it couldn't outmatch the fire in his gut. Tomorrow, he'd step into the fight of his life. No weapons, no uniforms, just him against a system that had erased him. Ethan squared his shoulders. He wasn't asking for the world, just a chance to count again. Ethan Marshall tightened his grip on his backpack straps, weaving through the swarm of reporters and staffers outside the Pennsylvania Avenue Hotel. Security guards loomed at every entrance, their stares cutting through the crowd. He had no press pass, no right to be here, just a fading military ID and a plan teetering on collapse. His pulse hammered. This wasn't just a long shot, it was a tightrope over a pit. He spotted a group of local reporters flashing badges at a side door, their chatter loud and distracted. Ethan squared his shoulders, tugged his jacket straight, and slipped in behind them, mimicking their hurried stride. He kept his head down, thumbing his dead phone like it held urgent notes. The army had taught him how to look the part. Confidence, control, no hesitation. The guard ahead waved the group through, barely glancing up as passes flickered past. Ethan held his breath, keeping tight with the pack, his boots silent. "Hey, stop!" A voice sliced through like a blade. Ethan froze, turning slow. James Brody, a hulking security guard with a face etched from hard years, blocked his path, hand up. "Press pass, now!" Ethan's gut clenched, but he kept his tone even. "Don't have one." James folded his arms, a wall of muscle and suspicion. "Then you're out. No pass, no entry, move." The reporters ahead vanished inside, leaving Ethan stranded under James's glare. His mind spun. He could run, duck into the crowd, but that'd mean quitting before he'd even swung. No chance in hell. He met James's eyes, probing for a weak spot. "You a vet?" James flinched, caught off balance, his jaw tightened. 8 years, Marines. "What's your game?" 10 years, Afghanistan, Ethan said, standing taller. "I'm not here to mess around. I need to talk to her, Leavitt. 5 seconds, that's all." James barked a dry laugh. "You think you can just stroll up to the press secretary? You got a death wish?" "Not dying," Ethan shot back. "Just need her to hear me. I'm out of options, jobless, evicted, done." "You've been there, haven't you?" James's eyes narrowed, but a flicker crossed them, something raw like he'd seen this story too many times. "What's your play? You some nut with a sign?" "No sign, no stunt," Ethan said, voice steady. "I need a job, not pity. You know what it's like when no one gives a damn." Silence hung heavy. Ethan's heart thudded, every second stretching like wire. He caught a glint of movement, another guard eyeing them from 10 feet off, hand hovering near his radio. If James called it in, Ethan was toast. He pressed harder. "Look, I'm not armed, not crazy. Just let me through. I'll take the heat if it goes south." James's jaw worked, chewing the decision. The second guard stepped closer, voice low. "Problem, Brody?" Ethan tensed, ready to bolt if it came to it. James shot the guy a look. "Back off, Mike, I'm handling it." He turned back to Ethan, voice dropping. "You're on thin ice, vet. Last row, mouth shut. One peep I don't like, I'll have cops here faster than you can blink. Clear?" Ethan nodded, adrenaline surging. "Clear. You won't hear a sound. Till I need to." James grunted, stepping aside. "You're a damned fool." He jerked his head toward the door. "Go." Ethan slipped through, heart pounding as he merged into the stream heading inside. The press room hit him like a wall of noise. Journalists packed tight, cameras humming, laptops clicking. He slid into a seat in the back next to a guy muttering into a recorder. No one noticed him yet, but the air crackled with pressure. The podium stood empty, White House seal glaring down. Karoline Leavitt was minutes away, and Ethan was a live wire in a room full of fuses. He clenched his fists under the table, sweat beading on his neck, James's warning rang loud, cops faster than you can blink, and now he saw the extra stakes. A woman 2 rows up glanced back, eyes lingering on his worn jacket. Did she clock him as an outsider? He shifted, keeping his face neutral. Then a guy in a cheap suit bumped his chair, dropping a notepad. Ethan handed it back, catching a muttered thanks. But the guy's squint held suspicion. Ethan's throat tightened. He wasn't invisible anymore. He was a glitch they might call out. The doors swung open and the room snapped to attention. Aides marched in, then Karoline Leavitt strode through, heels sharp, posture iron, her presence slamming the space silent. Younger than him, but she owned it, every eye and lens locked on her. Ethan's mouth went dry. This wasn't his battlefield, but the stakes felt higher than any firefight. James was outside, waiting for him to screw up. The woman ahead could turn, the guy beside him might ask questions. He'd bluffed his way in, but staying alive here meant playing it perfect. Until he didn't. Ethan's fingers dug into his knees. He'd promised quiet, but that wasn't the point. He needed Leavitt to see him, hear him, before the whole damn thing collapsed. The tension coiled tighter. Sit tight and vanish, or risk it all and strike. He'd tricked the gate, but the real fight was breathing down his neck. Ethan Marshall sat rigid in the last row, the press room buzzing like a live wire ready to snap. Journalists scribbled, cameras whirred, the air thick with anticipation. Karoline Leavitt stood at the podium, fielding questions with razor-sharp precision. Economy, foreign policy, every answer a masterclass in control. Ethan's palms sweated, his heart a drumbeat against his ribs. He'd tricked his way past James Brody, dodged the eyes of suspicious reporters, but this was the edge, his moment. He watched an aide signal Karoline from the side. Time winding down. Now or never. He shoved his chair back and stood. "Ms. Leavitt?" His voice cut through the room, steady but raw. The place froze. Heads whipped around, 100 eyes pinning him. Confusion rippled, whispers, gasps, the click of cameras swiveling. Who was this guy? No badge, no mic, just a worn jacket and a face they didn't know. Karoline's gaze snapped up, sharp as a blade. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Not panic, but a cold, quick calculation, weighing him like a chess piece. Security stirred, 2 guards edging closer, but she raised a hand. "Hold on." Ethan stepped forward, every nerve screaming. "My name's Ethan Marshall, 10 years in Afghanistan. I need a job." Silence shattered into chaos. Reporters erupted, muttered theories, furious typing, lenses zooming in. "Who's he with? Is this staged?" A guard lunged toward him, but Karoline's hand stayed up, freezing the man mid-step. She tilted her head, studying Ethan, her voice cool and unreadable. "You're saying you can't find work?" Ethan locked eyes with her, unflinching. "No one hires me. They see veteran and think I'm damaged, unfit, a risk. I'm not asking for charity. I want a fair shot." The room hummed, tension spiking. This wasn't politics anymore. It was personal, raw, a crack in the polished facade. Reporters scribbled faster, some half standing for a better shot. Karoline exhaled through her nose, arms crossing. "And you expect me to fix that?" Ethan's jaw tightened. She was baiting him, fishing for something she could deflect. He wouldn't bite. "I expect a chance, like any American gets. I fought for this country. Doesn't that count?" A murmur rolled through the crowd, some nodding, others skeptical. Karoline's face stayed a mask, but before she could respond, a voice sliced in, sharp and icy. "Are you seriously entertaining this?" Every head turned. Abigail Thornton, head of HR for a massive defense contractor, rose from the front row. Her gray suit was impeccable, her blonde hair a sleek frame around a face radiating authority. She fixed Karoline with a stare that could cut steel. "This is a circus, Leavitt, a political stunt. You acknowledge him, you're begging for trouble." Ethan's chest tightened as the room pivoted. Abigail stepped forward, her tone venomous. "You think companies can just throw jobs at every vet who storms a press conference? It's reckless. You're setting a precedent. Open the floodgates, and we'll drown in lawsuits from every desperate case out there." Karoline turned slightly, meeting Abigail's glare. "And if I don't?" "Then you're smart," Abigail snapped. But if you cave, I'll sue you myself. My firm won't eat the cost of your PR stunt. We have processes, rules, for a reason." The air thickened, a standoff crackling between them. Reporters leaned in, pens flying, cameras catching every twitch. Ethan stood caught in the crossfire, his plea now a grenade lobbed into a bigger war. He hadn't expected this, hadn't planned for a corporate titan to turn his fight into her battleground. His fists clenched. Abigail's threat wasn't just words, she had the clout to back it up, and Karoline knew it. Karoline's lips pressed thin, her eyes flicking between Abigail and Ethan. The room held its breath, waiting for her to pick a side, dismiss him or defy the machine. She uncrossed her arms, voice measured, neutral as a tightrope. "Let's hear him out first. What's your ask, Marshal?" Ethan swallowed, the weight of every lens on him. "A job, not a favor. Just a real chance to prove I'm worth it. Vets like me, we're not liabilities, we're assets. No one's tapping." Abigail scoffed, loud enough to echo. "Assets? You're a liability right now, disrupting this, wasting time. This isn't a job fair, it's a press conference. Leavitt, shut this down before it spirals." Karoline didn't flinch, her gaze steady on Ethan. "You think you're the only one? Thousands of vets out there. Why you?" "Because I'm here," Ethan said, voice rising. "I'm the one who walked in, who's asking. You say you're for Americans, prove it! Or is it all just talk?" A gasp rippled through. He'd thrown the gauntlet and the room ate it up, headlines already forming. Karoline's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, respect, irritation, crossing her face. Abigail stepped closer, voice low but lethal. "You're playing with fire, Karoline. Give him anything and you'll have a mob at your door tomorrow. My lawyers are ready, don't test me." The guards hovered, waiting for a signal. Ethan's pulse roared. He'd lit the match, but Abigail was pouring gas, and Karoline stood in the middle, unreadable. She tapped her fingers on the podium, once, twice, then stepped back. "Come up here, Marshal." The room exploded. Shouts, clicks, a wave of disbelief. Ethan froze for half a heartbeat, then moved, legs carrying him past stunned reporters, past Abigail's blazing glare, up to the stage. The lights blinded him, but he didn't care. He stood beside Karoline, facing the chaos, every nerve electric. She turned to him, voice low, no trace of warmth. "You've got their attention. If I give you a shot, what do you do with it?" Ethan met her stare, unwavering. "I prove vets aren't broken. We're the backbone this country's ignoring." Abigail's voice rang out, cutting through. "This is a mistake, Leavitt. You'll regret it." Karoline didn't turn, her focus locked on Ethan. "Maybe," she said, neutral as ever. "But let's see what he's got." She faced the crowd, voice firm. "We're not done here." The room detonated again, questions flying, cameras zooming. Ethan stood tall, Abigail fuming, Karoline poised between them. He'd forced her hand, but the real clash was just igniting. The press room erupted as Karoline Leavitt's words landed like a thunderclap. Ethan Marshall stood beside her on the stage, light searing his eyes, the roar of shouted questions deafening. Reporters lunged forward, microphones outstretched, cameras zeroing in. Abigail Thornton's face twisted with fury, her voice barely audible over the chaos as she hissed, "You've lost your mind, Leavitt." Karoline ignored her, adjusting the mic with a steady hand. "Starting Monday, Mr. Marshall will join the Department of Veterans Affairs. He wants to prove something? He'll do it from the inside." Ethan's breath caught, the weight of it slamming into him. A job, not a promise, not a dodge, a real shot. The crowd surged with noise, some cheered, others jeered, but Abigail cut through, her tone venomous. "This is reckless. You're pandering, and it'll backfire, mark my words." She turned on her heel, storming out, her exit a silent vow of war. Karoline didn't flinch, her gaze sliding to Ethan. "Don't screw this up," she muttered, then stepped away, leaving him alone under the spotlight. The room dissolved into a frenzy, analysts spinning takes, aides scrambling. Ethan barely heard it, his mind racing. He'd come for a chance and walked away with a lifeline, or a noose. Abigail's threat lingered like smoke. She wasn't done with him or Karoline, but for now, he'd won. He stepped off the stage, legs unsteady, the weight of every lens still on him. Monday loomed, and with it, a fight he hadn't fully grasped. Monday morning, Ethan stood outside the Department of Veterans Affairs building, its gray bulk a fortress of paperwork and broken promises. Cameras had trailed him since the press conference, some calling him a hero, others a gimmick. He didn't care what they thought. He was here. He adjusted his backpack and walked in, the hum of fluorescent lights greeting him. Employees glanced up, some curious, some annoyed, then went back to their screens. The air smelled of coffee and old files, but underneath was something heavier: indifference. A woman at the front desk peered over her glasses. "Marshall, right? Thornton's waiting." Her tone was flat, but her eyes held a flicker of something. Pity, maybe? Ethan nodded, following her directions down a hall lined with cubicles. Phones rang, keyboards clacked, but the vibe was off, like a machine running on fumes. Abigail Thornton stood at the end of the corridor, arms crossed, her gray suit as sharp as her glare. She'd swapped her press conference fury for a cold, professional edge, but Ethan felt the heat beneath it. "I didn't sign off on this," she said as he approached. "Leavitt forced you down my throat." Ethan stopped, meeting her stare. "I'm here now. Deal with it." Her lips twitched, not quite a smirk. "Oh, I will." She turned, motioning him into a cramped office. A desk waited in the corner, buried under a teetering stack of files. "Your first job," she said, pointing. "Process those. Good luck." She left without another word, her heels clicking a retreat. Ethan sat, the chair creaking under him. He grabbed the top file: John Rivera, Vietnam vet, disability claim pending 15 years. His gut twisted. The next: Sarah Kim, Iraq, PTSD, denied, waiting 6 years. He flipped through more: decades of delays, rejections for missing forms, cases lost in limbo. These weren't just papers, they were people, rotting in the system's gears. He'd expected resistance, but not this. A machine built to bury the people it was meant to help. He dialed John Rivera's number, hands shaking with anger. 3 rings, then a tired voice answered. "Yeah? Mr. Rivera, I'm Ethan Marshall. VA, I've got your file." A dry laugh. "First call in years. You're going to tell me no again?" "Not today," Ethan said. "Tell me what happened." For 20 minutes, he listened. Shrapnel wounds, endless appeals, a life stalled by red tape. When the call ended, Ethan stared at the stack. This wasn't about him anymore. He'd gotten in, but these people were still trapped. By noon, Abigail was back, leaning in the doorway. "How's our hero doing?" Ethan didn't look up, flipping a file. "You see this? 15 years for a claim." "Explain that," she shrugged. "System's clogged, not my problem, or yours. Stick to your lane." "My lane," he stood, voice rising. "These are vets, people I fought with. You're fine letting them rot." Her eyes hardened. "You're not a crusader, Marshall. You're a clerk. Process the damn files, or I'll have you out by Friday." Ethan stepped closer. "You don't scare me. I've faced worse than you." Abigail's smile was thin. "Keep pushing and you'll see worse here." She tossed a memo on his desk. New guidelines, tighter deadlines, her signature at the bottom. "Follow that, or you're gone." She walked off, leaving the threat hanging. Ethan skimmed the memo. Rules designed to trip him up, slow him down. She wasn't just resisting, she was sabotaging. He sat, fury boiling, and grabbed Sarah Kim's file. Another call, another story, nightmares, lost appeals, a woman broken by bureaucracy. "I thought they'd help," she whispered. They didn't. He promised to dig deeper, hung up, and slammed the file down. Abigail wanted him quiet, he'd be louder. That afternoon, he stormed her office, dropping a handful of files on her desk. "Look at these. Denials, delays, years of nothing. Why?" Abigail barely glanced up. "Because that's how it works. You think you can fix decades of mess?" "I think you're not trying," he snapped. "These people served. Same as me. You're burying them." She leaned forward, voice low. "You're a pawn, Marshall. Leavitt's stunt doesn't change reality. Push too hard, and you're out. No job, no platform, back off." Ethan didn't blink. "I'm not here for me anymore, I'll fight for them." with or without you. Her eyes flashed, a crack in her cool. You'll regret that. She shoved a new stack at him. Hundreds of pages, impossible deadlines. Start there, fail, and I'll bury you. Ethan took the stack, jaw set. He'd expected a wall. Abigail was a bulldozer. But every file fueled him, every name a reason to push. That night, he stayed late, digging through cases, calling vets, building a list of the forgotten. Abigail could stack the deck, he'd flip the table. By week's end, word spread, vets emailing him, thanking him for calls no one else made. Abigail noticed, her glares sharper, her memos stricter. She cornered him Friday. You're stirring trouble. Stop, or I'll end this. Ethan met her gaze. End it then. I'm not stopping. She paused, then smirked. Your funeral. She walked away, but Ethan knew he'd rattled her. The system was cracked, and he was prying it open, one vet at a time. Ethan Marshall slumped at his cluttered VA desk, surrounded by stacks of veteran files, each a lifeline he'd fought to pull from the system's jaws. Abigail Thornton's sabotage had only fueled him, her threats sharpening his resolve. Late that night, an email pinged from an anonymous VA staffer. Check Leavitt's latest briefing. You're a prop, not a fix. Ethan's guts sank. He clicked a news link. Karoline Leavitt poised at a podium, touting action for veterans, with his name dropped like a trophy. No policy details, no funding, just polished sound bites. His fight, his face, twisted into her PR win. He dug deeper, pulling up her past speeches. Same pattern, vague promises, his story as a feel-good hook. Nothing concrete for vets like John Rivera or Sarah Kim. The job she'd given him wasn't a solution, it was a stage prop. A way to dodge real change while cameras rolled. Abigail's venom made sense now. Karoline had played them both. Rage burned through him, hotter than any battlefield fire. He'd trusted her, bared his soul on that stage, and she'd turned it into a political game. By morning, Ethan made his choice. He drafted a resignation, short and brutal. I came to the VA to help veterans, not to be Karoline Leavitt's puppet. She sold me a lie and she's selling you one too. This system won't change unless we make it. He filmed himself reading it outside the VA building, voice steady, eyes blazing. No polish, just truth. He posted it online, Twitter, YouTube, anywhere it'd sticked, tagged Leavitt, and hit send. Then he walked away, backpack slung over his shoulder. Done. The video blew up within hours. Hashtags flared, Leavitt lied, vets fight back. Retweets piling up, comments raging. News picked it up, veteran quits, slams press secretary in viral video. Abigail's silence was deafening. Karoline's team scrambled, issuing a bland denial. We remain committed to veterans. Ethan didn't watch the fallout. He sat in his empty apartment staring at the eviction notice, wondering if he'd torched his last bridge or lit a fuse. His phone buzzed late that night, a message from Sarah Kim, the Iraq vet whose file he'd pulled. Saw your video, you're right. They don't care. I'm in if you are. We can do this ourselves. Ethan paused, her words sinking in. Sarah, tough, broken, but unbroken, knew the stakes. He typed back, I'm in. Let's talk. A spark flickered. Not hope yet, but something close. He wasn't alone. The system had chewed him up, Karoline had used him, but Ethan wasn't done. Sarah's note was a lifeline, a hint of an alliance, a chance to hit back harder. He leaned back, exhaling. The fight he'd started in that press room wasn't over. It was shifting, growing, out of their control. Whatever came next, he'd face it on his terms. Ethan's journey teaches us that trust in systems, or people, can blind us to their flaws. He fought for a chance, only to find the game rigged, but his refusal to stay silent sparked a new fight. In life, we must question who holds power over our struggles and push back when they fail us. It's not just survival, it's purpose. Thanks for joining this story. What's your take? Would you stand up like Ethan? Drop a comment, hit like, and share your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation alive. Your voice matters too.